and you never had a relationship and were only friends with benefits. To prove that Mr. Birch is the biological father of your 23-month-old son, Unai. That you have had a romantic relationship with Mr. Birch since 2009, and his paternity denial makes you furious.
Yes, Your Honor.
Mr. Birch, you claim that Ms. Cox, you say that you were not having sex with her during the window of conception and are here to prove you are not the father.
Your Honor, he's denying my son because he doesn't want the responsibility of another.
Your Honor, we only had a friends with benefits since we first started, and I made it clear to her.
But it is said and done now. I'm here today to let him know that this is his child, and I would appreciate if he step up and take care of him.
Commitment.
No commitment.
Just being friends.
Just being friends and having sex.
And having sex.
When truth walks into the courtroom, everything changes. When Judge Lauren Lake opens that envelope, hearts break, lies unravel, and families rediscover the line between love and law. This is not just about DNA. It's about the invisible bridge between justice and emotion, the fragile bond that makes people both hide and seek the truth. Because in paternity court, the past doesn't stay silent forever. In a courtroom led by the commanding voice of Judge Lauren Lake, every case becomes more than a legal proceeding. It becomes a study in the human condition. On the surface, these are stories about paternity, betrayal, or family conflict. But beneath that polished veneer of law and order lies something much deeper, the eternal struggle between truth, love, and denial. Did friends with benefits have a child? May sound like another episode of courtroom television, but it represents a mirror held up to modern relationships, a reflection of what happens when passion outpaces clarity and when emotion replaces reason. At its core, this case is about the courage to confront evidence, the humility to face DNA, and the heartbreak of realizing that sometimes the truth doesn't heal, it divides. The DNA test in this courtroom is not just science, it's a symbol. It's the last word that can silence months or years of argument, suspicion, and emotional turmoil. But what most people don't realize is that some people regret taking it. Because once the test results are read aloud, there's no way to go back. You can't unlearn the truth. And as the Game-Changing Attorney podcast once said, evidence is powerful, but it doesn't heal broken trust. When Judge Lauren Lake sits behind her bench, she does more than interpret the law. She mediates between justice and emotion, between proof and pain. Her courtroom becomes the stage of evidence, where every sigh, tear, and accusation becomes a piece of testimony. What happens here is not merely about finding a father. It's about uncovering truths people have long buried to protect themselves from pain. In this case, two individuals who once shared intimacy now stand across from each other as adversaries. They once called each other friend. They once shared laughter, vulnerability, and the kind of closeness that blurs the lines between love and convenience. But when a child entered the story, friendship dissolved into confusion, and confusion into conflict. It's a pattern the court sees often. What began as casual connection ends in courtroom confrontation. This is where Judge Lauren Lake's courtroom differs from any other. It is not just a place of verdicts, it's a place of reckoning. She reminds everyone that while the Adverse Inference in Evidence Act may guide lawyers, and the Supreme Court may define procedure, justice, in its purest form, begins in the heart. It's not about who wins, but who has the courage to tell the truth, even when that truth destroys the illusion they've been living under. Throughout her years presiding over emotional cases, Judge Lake has shown how the relationship between law and justice is never simple. Law requires evidence. Justice requires empathy. Law demands facts. Justice listens to feelings. In this delicate balance, Lauren Lake has become a voice that both comforts and corrects. In this episode, as she navigates conflicting testimonies, she doesn't just ask for evidence, she demands accountability, because the courtroom isn't merely a stage for drama, it's a sanctuary for truth. When the DNA test is presented, both parties feel the weight of it. For one, it's a lifeline to finally gain acknowledgement, support, and closure. For the other, it's a threat, proof that could rewrite the rest of their life. Behind that envelope lies more than genetic data. It holds the power to reorder relationships, to reshape the past, and to redefine the meaning of family. People regret taking DNA tests, Judge Lake once said on record, not because of what they find, but because it changes what they believe. That's the raw truth behind the phrase, truth changes everything. Once truth enters a space, denial must leave. Once evidence appears, emotion must bow. And yet, even as the results are read, even as the science speaks, there's an ache that law cannot touch. Because behind every test, there's a story, a late-night phone call, a broken promise, an unplanned pregnancy, a heart hoping that maybe, just maybe, love will outweigh truth. In the wider lens of jurisprudence, this case reveals the concept of justice not as a cold formula, but as a living force. Jurisprudence, the philosophy of law, teaches that justice is both moral and social, subjective and systemic. In Judge Lake's courtroom, that philosophy comes alive. Every glance, every trembling voice, every denial becomes part of a living thesis, that justice must not only be served, it must be felt. That is why her show has become more than a courtroom. It's a podcast of humanity, a testimony of recovery, a living classroom for anyone who believes in the redemptive power of truth. It stands alongside platforms like the Divorce Course podcast and Celebrate Recovery testimonies, creating a bridge between legal reasoning and emotional healing. The stories that unfold in her courtroom echo far beyond television. They enter podcasts, law schools, therapy sessions, and late-night reflections. They become case studies for attorneys, warnings for lovers, and inspirations for those struggling to rebuild. Each episode becomes an adoption story of sorts, not the legal adoption of a child, but the emotional adoption of truth into one's life. Because truth, once accepted, becomes a part of who we are. This particular case is also a quiet critique of how modern relationships blur boundaries. The friends with benefits era promised freedom, but often delivered confusion. It shows how emotional attachment can grow in the shadows of casual intimacy, and how the lack of clear intention can create lifelong consequences. In many ways, it's a reflection of a generation that sought connection without commitment, and found themselves entangled in evidence instead of affection. As Judge Lauren Lake navigates these testimonies, she doesn't only listen to words, she listens to patterns. When she hears contradictions, she recognizes the adverse inference, the silence that speaks louder than speech. In her courtroom, evidence is not just physical, it's behavioral. Every hesitation, every misremembered date, every defensive reaction becomes part of the unspoken record. And through it all, the camera captures the humanity of both sides. The mother hoping for validation, the alleged father hoping for vindication, the audience holding its breath, the law waiting to speak. But before that envelope is opened, there's always a lesson. Judge Lauren Lake reminds everyone that paternity is not just about biology, it's about responsibility. That child support is not a punishment, but a partnership with the truth, and that the real Supreme Court in these matters is the conscience. For viewers who follow legal content, the Game-Changing Attorney podcast, the Divorce Course podcast, and other programs exploring the relationship between law and justice, this episode is a powerful exploration of how human choices interact with legal consequence. It's about how one night of vulnerability can lead to years of legal complexity, how emotional honesty can be more elusive than factual evidence, and how justice sometimes feels more like heartbreak than closure. As the episode unfolds, you begin to realize that this isn't just one woman's story or one man's defense. It's a collective human experience. Across courtrooms, podcasts, and legal systems, people struggle with the same truth. Love may be blind, but justice never is. In the corridors of this courtroom, truth echoes louder than denial. And when Judge Lauren Lake finally speaks the verdict, she reminds us all, truth may hurt, but it heals in ways lies never can. The courtroom becomes a silent battlefield the moment that envelope appears. Everyone knows what's inside, yet no one is truly ready to face it. Judge Lauren Lake often says, the DNA test doesn't lie, but hearts still do. That statement captures the soul of her courtroom, where truth is absolute, but acceptance is optional. In this episode, she confronts the timeless tension between law and love. And it feels as if we're watching a real-time debate between philosophy and emotion. This is not just a case about paternity, it's an exploration of human truth. When the DNA results determine the future of a family, we're forced to ask, what is justice when the evidence is undeniable, but the heart refuses to believe? That's the paradox Judge Lake has spent years dissecting. The relationship between law and justice. Law is what she enforces, justice is what she searches for. The courtroom is her laboratory, and every case is an experiment in truth. When the Friends with Benefits case unfolds, it exposes how blurred emotional boundaries can become legal liabilities. It's the perfect metaphor for modern relationships, connections that begin without clarity and end in confrontation. The parties involved stand before her, not as enemies, but as examples of what happens when people replace communication with assumption. Their words reveal regret, resentment, and the silent hope that maybe, somehow, DNA will rewrite the story they've been living. But DNA never rewrites. It only reveals. Judge Lauren Lake has often used her platform to explain how evidence functions in both law and life. She references real-world legal concepts like the Adverse Inference in Evidence Act, which allows courts to draw conclusions when a party withholds proof or fails to cooperate. In emotional terms, it's what happens when one person hides from accountability. When you avoid truth, silence becomes its own confession. That's the beauty of her courtroom. It merges jurisprudence with humanity. It's a masterclass in how the concept of justice in jurisprudence is not confined to dusty law books. It breathes, cries, and forgives. It exists in the spaces between the spoken and unspoken, in the glances that reveal guilt, in the tremble of a mother's hands when she hopes a piece of paper will finally prove what her heart already knows. But what makes this case unforgettable is not the verdict. It's the lesson it leaves behind. The mother's story reflects the vulnerability that love often disguises. She entered what she thought was a casual arrangement, but as time passed, affection grew roots. In her heart, friendship transformed into commitment. She dreamed of a family, even when the other party didn't. This emotional dissonance is common in relationships today, where intimacy precedes intention. The alleged father, on the other hand, embodies denial, not necessarily of truth, but of accountability. For him, the Friends with Benefits label was a shield, a way to engage without obligation. Yet when confronted with the possibility of fatherhood, that shield crumbled. The same man who once enjoyed the freedom of emotional detachment now stands beneath the scrutiny of evidence. It's a transformation many people fear, when personal choices become legal consequences, when the private becomes public, when passion steps onto the stage in a divorce case, or in this instance, a paternity trial. It's the same stage where tears, timelines, and testimonies collide, and where Judge Lake ensures that no one hides behind technicalities. She doesn't just quote the law, she translates it. When she speaks, you don't hear a judge, you hear justice itself. Her words are often echoed in law podcasts and recovery platforms like the Game-Changing Attorney podcast, the Divorce Course podcast, and Celebrate Recovery Testimonies. Spaces where professionals and survivors alike analyze how truth and reconciliation intersect. Because while lawyers discuss evidence, Judge Lake discusses human evidence, tone, motive, intent. Her courtroom becomes a living podcast episode, where each voice contributes to an ever-evolving dialogue about integrity and responsibility. As the case progresses, we're reminded that truth doesn't just expose, it also educates. The audience witnesses the anatomy of denial. The man's arguments begin to crumble under the precision of Lauren Lake's questioning. She dissects inconsistencies with surgical calm, exposing how easily memory bends under guilt. Every contradiction becomes a wound of its own. In the background, the mother's silence becomes louder than words. Her pain is not theatrical, it's ancient. It speaks to every woman who has ever been left carrying the burden of proof. She's not only fighting for recognition, she's fighting for justice to feel personal again. And when Judge Lake finally reads the DNA results, it feels like the courtroom itself holds its breath. For a moment, time freezes. Science and emotion meet in a single heartbeat. And when the answer comes, one simple line of genetic truth, it's not just a verdict. It's the sound of illusion breaking. Some people cry from relief, others from realization, because when the truth changes everything, it doesn't discriminate between guilt and innocence. It simply reveals what is. What follows is perhaps the most powerful part of the show, the reflection. Judge Lauren Lake doesn't just end with the results, she transforms them into life lessons. She addresses the parties not as litigants, but as people in recovery, recovering from denial, misunderstanding, and misplaced trust. It's why her courtroom feels less like punishment and more like celebrate recovery testimonies, each case becoming its own confessional. She often reminds her audience that truth isn't always kind, but it's always cleansing. It's the only foundation strong enough to rebuild on. And in cases like this, rebuilding means redefining what family means. When DNA says, not the father, it doesn't erase the bond that might have formed. It simply clarifies it. It separates biology from love, obligation from compassion. The court can order child support, but only the heart can order understanding. Judge Lauren Lake's compassion never overshadows her clarity. She respects the Supreme Court principles of justice, yet her empathy reminds us that every verdict also needs a touch of mercy. Her rulings echo the duality of jurisprudence, that justice must be lawful and humane. In her reflections, she addresses the broader cultural issue, how modern relationships have evolved in an age of blurred definitions. The friends with benefits culture often glamorizes freedom without responsibility. Yet when real life intervenes, when a child is born, when emotions deepen, the lines vanish, and what remains is accountability. Through this, the episode becomes a mirror, not just for the couple, but for society. It questions what happens when intimacy becomes transactional, when promises dissolve into misunderstandings, and when emotional negligence leads to legal consequence. At one point, Judge Lake's commentary touches on how truth is the great equalizer. Whether it appears in a Supreme Court ruling or a daytime courtroom, it wields the same power to correct, to expose, to transform. Her voice becomes both a verdict and a sermon. She connects the concept of justice in jurisprudence to everyday life, showing how moral truth often precedes legal truth. The DNA test cheating stories that surface in her courtroom often go viral for their drama, but their real power lies in their lesson. Every secret has an expiration date. Every lie has a limit. When the test results are revealed, the performance ends, and only reality remains. This is where Lauren Lake shines. She understands that justice isn't just for the record, it's for the soul. She gives people the chance not just to win or lose, but to wake up. Her verdicts feel less like punishment and more like awakenings. Moments that push people to confront who they've become and who they still want to be. Even after the cameras stop rolling, her lessons linger in the minds of those who watch. Legal scholars quote her words in law classes. Podcast hosts replay her insights in discussions about the moral dimension of family law. And families at home see their own struggles reflected on screen. Their own doubts, their own regrets, their own need for truth. Every time she reads a verdict, she redefines justice, not as vengeance but as clarity. She teaches that the goal is not to shame but to shed light, to remind everyone that mistakes don't end stories. They simply rewrite them with honesty. That's why viewers return to her courtroom, not for spectacle, but for closure, because in a world full of deception, watching someone find truth, even painfully, feels like redemption. Judge Lauren Lake's courtroom is a place where the game changes, where evidence replaces accusation, where truth replaces assumption and where justice finally meets humanity. It's no surprise that her episodes feel like the audio reflections of the Game-Changing Attorney podcast. Deep, structured, and transformative. And when she looks at the parties, her voice softens. You can't choose your truth, she says, but you can choose what to do with it. That single line carries the emotional and moral core of her courtroom. It summarizes not just one case but an entire philosophy. That truth changes everything, but healing changes you. The courtroom grows still after the results are read. The truth, though short in words, feels infinite in weight. Judge Lauren Lake has always said that truth is the only thing that can silence chaos. And in this moment, silence isn't emptiness, it's recognition. The parties who once shouted over one another now sit in reflection, each absorbing a truth they can no longer escape. In paternity court, what happens after the verdict is just as important as the verdict itself, because here, truth doesn't end relationships, it redefines them. When DNA reveals that two people who once shared everything are no longer bound by biology, the court must remind them that love and accountability don't need genetic proof. That's where Lauren Lake's voice transforms from that of a judge to that of a mentor, guiding not only the parties in front of her, but also the millions watching who see their own pain mirrored in every tear, every sigh, every whispered, "Your Honor." She reminds everyone that the law may focus on evidence, but justice focuses on humanity. The courtroom becomes a bridge between both worlds, a living example of the relationship between law and justice. In a way, this courtroom is where philosophy and practicality meet. It's where the concept of justice in jurisprudence becomes something you can see, touch, and feel. And that's what makes Judge Lake's approach so revolutionary. In her hands, the evidence stage isn't just about showing proof. It's about confronting denial. It's where emotional accountability meets legal structure. The DNA test may prove or disprove paternity, but it also exposes something greater, who people become when faced with truth. The aftermath of this particular case echoes what Lauren Lake has seen countless times. People discovering that truth changes everything, but it doesn't have to destroy everything. She encourages each person to see the verdict not as punishment, but as a pivot. To move forward not with resentment but with awareness. She often references a simple but profound belief. Justice is not about revenge, it's about recovery. That's why the emotional recovery in her courtroom feels similar to what you hear in Celebrate Recovery testimonies. Raw, unfiltered confessions of human weakness transformed into strength. After the test results, tears become admissions. Silence becomes surrender. Pride dissolves into the realization that growth begins where denial ends. Judge Lauren Lake doesn't let the moment pass without reflection. She turns to the woman, the one who believed that love would be enough, and she speaks to her not as a litigant, but as a sister in struggle. You are more than this mistake. You are not defined by his denial or this decision. You are defined by how you rise after the truth. Then she turns to the man, the one who hid behind logic, the one who thought that friendship without commitment could protect him from consequence. You have a chance, she says, to be the man your choices tried to hide. Her words cut deeper than any gavel strike. They don't just deliver judgment, they offer redemption. That is what sets her apart. Unlike many legal figures who stop at the letter of the law, Lauren Lake goes further, into its soul. She believes in what philosophers call living justice, the kind that breathes and evolves with compassion. Her courtroom might reference statutes and acts like the Adverse Inference in Evidence Act, but its spirit aligns closer to what moral jurisprudence teaches, that the purpose of justice is not to destroy lives, but to rebuild them on the foundation of truth. She knows that behind every DNA test, there's a story of hope, betrayal, and humanity. These are not just cheating stories. They are stories of people who risked everything for validation. People who didn't realize that finding the truth could sometimes be as painful as losing it. That's why her courtroom feels both sacred and educational, like a real-time podcast of the human soul. Her words echo beyond television. They're discussed on the Game Changing Attorney podcast, quoted in the Divorce Course podcast, and debated in law schools under the topic Empathy and Jurisprudence. She's become a symbol of how the relationship between law and justice can evolve in modern society where compassion and accountability coexist. In a world where courtroom shows often focus on spectacle, Paternity Court stands apart because it deals with the anatomy of truth. The testimonies may begin as conflict, but under Lauren Lake's guidance, they often end as confessions. Her method transcends legal tradition. It's therapeutic jurisprudence. She doesn't just seek a verdict, she seeks closure. And closure, she reminds us, doesn't always mean resolution. It often means release. After this particular case concludes, she delivers a closing reflection that resonates far beyond the courtroom walls. We live in a time, she says, where people want freedom without responsibility. But the truth is, real freedom only comes when you're responsible for what you create, emotionally, legally, and spiritually. Her words summarize what the Friends with Benefits case truly represents: the collision of emotion without boundaries and law without mercy. It's a wake-up call for a generation that confuses intimacy with connection and convenience. With care, she then reminds the viewers of the Supreme Court's symbolic role in justice, not as a distant institution, but as a reminder that truth must always have authority. Yet even the highest courts cannot legislate the human heart. That's where people must do their own internal work, the kind